want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Folks, we're approaching the 80th anniversary of one of the most consequential moments in modern history. And that was the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944. That moment was an inflection point where the battle against Hitler, the battle against the Nazis, and against the darkness that had descended over Europe, that was the moment that truly changed the direction, the velocity of that war. Today, joining me, I'm delighted to have Garrett Graff on the program. Garrett has written an absolutely tremendous new book called When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day. Garrett, I want to welcome you to the show first off, and thank you very much for coming on. You talk about the history of this through the voices of over 700 separate interviews that you went through, from original source materials, from audio, video, written histories that have been collected since that moment. I mean, obviously, all the major players have long since passed, and frankly, even the youngest of the soldiers that landed on those beaches or parachuted into those hedgerows on that night are leaving us. We're almost, that generation has almost disappeared. Talk to me about how you approached this gigantic mountain of data and information and insights and interviews on this story, and what did it teach you about this moment in history?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Rick. I think that this is a hugely important topic and moment to be talking about and reflecting upon this week. As you said, this is the moment where the greatest generation is really passing from the scene. There on D-Day, June 6, 1944, there were 1 million Allied personnel on the move across England and the English Channel that day. There are perhaps a few thousand of them left worldwide. The UK actually believes that there are only 6 living D-Day veterans left in Great Britain. And for me, I wanted to try to compile this oral history now as we watch this momentous time slip entirely from memory into history, and to try to recreate that day and its audacity and the courage and the bravery that it took to make it through that day, to make it successfully to the Normandy coast and to invade France. And tell that story through the voices of the people who lived it and the people who experienced it. Because I think, to me, there's an important and unique power that comes from oral history. That when I've certainly written a lot of narrative history, as you know, over my career, but in oral history, I think you get a sense of just how chaotic and uncertain big titanic moments like this were as they unfolded for the people who were living them. I think narrative history, try as hard as you might, there's a tendency to make things seem, neater, cleaner, more linear, more predetermined than they normally are, or than they actually are as they were lived. And so, we look back on D-Day as this enormous triumph, this day of unparalleled bravery and courage and heroism by the Allies. Well, when you read the letters of the sailors crossing the English Channel on the night of June 5th, when you hear the memories of the paratroopers flying across from England that night, there's not a lot of sense of bravery and courage and heroism in their words.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
they are scared, they are lonely, they are wondering if they are going to make it through to the end of the next day. And most of all, in a very poignant way, they're nervous about whether they have what it takes to perform in battle. You know,
Sure.
whether they are going to let down their colleagues and comrades
Mm-hmm.
in the moment they are needed most, than in the next 24 hours. And to me, I think that this is such an important moment to reflect upon, because this is probably the most important moment in Western democracy in our history. D-Day is. It is an invasion unlike almost any other in human history. An invasion launched not to conquer or seize, but to liberate. The Allies that day are fighting for among the most noble causes that humans have ever fought.
Yep.
And here we are 80 years later in 2024, caught up in this big national conversation about what America is and what it isn't. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times today about this, about, one simple way to define what America is and what it isn't is what we're willing to fight for.
Mm-hmm.
And that this story of D-Day and the story of the bravery and courage and heroism of a lot of very young men, by the way. I mean, these
Absolutely.
are 18, 19-year-olds. I mean, 19-year-old paratroopers who are on their third invasion, after, North Africa, Sicily,
Right.
Italy, now returning to the continent for D-Day. Grizzled veteran 21-year-old, 22-year-old sergeants who are leading these new soldiers into battle. And I think we're left with a really important question right now of what we are going to do as a country with the legacy that this greatest generation won for democracy and for America and for the world.
I think that's a really important point, Garrett, and one that you look at this book, and I think it speaks to a whole spectrum of things about the American and the Western role in the world. And not only was it something that required manifest physical courage from so many of these very young men, as you point out, these kids, these children. In our day and age, a 21-year-old still has mommy tracking his cell phone, and they live in a much different physical universe. But it was also the seriousness of the leadership of these people and their willingness to take risks, their willingness to take massive responsibility for. I mean, Eisenhower. I've always contemplated this from the narrative histories, but I loved reading through all the observations of Eisenhower in the days before that are in this book. The stress on him, the tension, the weight, the even stuff down to like the weather forecasters worried they were letting Ike down because he was so terrified we were going to lose this one unique window where 1 million people, 7,000 landing craft, thousands of aircraft, all these things, all of it had to work in one moment. And the responsibilities came onto the shoulders. And I love that you capture it from the lowest, the private first class to Eisenhower and Churchill and the dynamics, the interplay between them. I mean, that was a story that I knew the story from the narrative histories, but I had never read the quotes about it. Eisenhower wanted to go on to the HMS Belfast so he would be there at Normandy and be there, as the troops were going into the most consequential moment of battle in their history. And that story of how basically Ike and the king conspired to keep him from putting himself at that great a risk. But all of these men, and 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 they face this moment of enormous demand on them for their moral and physical courage. But it was also a triumph of cooperation, organization, management, like the willingness to do big things in this country seems to have fallen away in a lot of ways. We fight over the most inconsequential garbage in Congress, and we don't take on the screaming, absolute, immediate crises. And that's one thing I loved about reading this, is this sense of clarity they all had about what the mission was. All the getting there was hard, but what they had to do, one of Churchill calls it the majestic, inevitable, and terrible task of this war. And I think that is something, when you read this book, you get that sense. And it was disappointing on the one hand, but heartening on the other. We've done harder things than we face right now. Excuse me.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that as a writer really surprised me about this book was so much of the book ends up taking place before D-Day. You know, you sit down to write a book on D-Day and you're like, okay, it's one day. Like, you know, here's the day. And then really the first third of the book is exactly as you're talking about, the planning, the logistics. And again, one of the things I think narrative history doesn't capture that you see in these quotes from Roosevelt, from Churchill, from Eisenhower,
right,
from Bernard Montgomery, the British general in charge, is that those first years of World War II are really Britain and America learning how to be allies together. You know, that we have this, you know, sort of, again, historical vision of America and Britain are the world's greatest, strongest ally and always have been.
Right. Special
relationship, blah, 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 blah. Those first couple of years, it was a real struggle for the countries to learn how to cooperate, how to work together. You know, the work that Churchill has to do to sort of pry America forward from its isolationism of the 1930s. There's this amazing, you know, I have this chapter about Pearl Harbor, and that to me is one of the most poignant of the whole book, where, you know, Churchill has felt that for years by 1941 that he is fighting almost alone against Nazi totalitarianism, and that he talks about how on the night of December 7th, 1941, he slept so well because he knew that democracy was saved. That he was like, you know, I don't know exactly how it's going to unfold. I don't know, you know, I had no sense of how hard it was going to be at that moment. But I knew that Hitler was finished, Mussolini was finished, that Japan would be ground to dust. That's his exact words. Japan ground to dust. Because once you sort of awakened and angered America, that there was going to be no stopping the industrial might and military might that the U.S. was going to be able to bring to bear. And that then from there, you have these 2 years of them basically throwing everything they can into the planning of this one invasion. And this Herculean task, you know, as you said, sort of more audacious than probably anything humans had ever tried to accomplish, and probably will ever try to accomplish ever again.
It is the scope of it still evades, I think, that, you know, look, I mean, and I love Stephen Ambrose. I love the Band of Brothers books, and this, and I think the Spielberg interpretation of it is brilliant. But I think too many Americans look at it as just this, like, these brave young men jumped out of a plane or ran off of a boat onto a beach. They fought well and they killed Nazis. The killing of the Nazis came in factories in Dearborn, Michigan, and Philadelphia, and in this massive industrialized effort that transformed America into this machine that was putting out, you know, we were building a bomber off the line at River Run every 45 minutes in World War II. And this idea that it all had to come together in one moment. It's really, it's the old, saw about, amateurs talk tactics and semi-pros talk strategy and pros talk logistics when it comes to military stuff. This was a logistics thing. We moved millions of Americans and billions of tons of equipment across the U-boat infested Atlantic by building tens of thousands of cargo ships, moving all this material. I mean, and the thing that strikes me is the idea of us becoming allies. It was a weird culture shock for a lot of Americans. And I think one of the most moving parts of the book is you talk about how African-American soldiers arrived in Britain, and they were coming from Jim Crow America, and they were essentially welcomed by the Brits with open arms. There were tensions between the American military leadership and white American troops and these African Americans who were treated equally in Britain, probably for the first time in their lives.
Absolutely.
I thought that was, with 1 million African Americans who served under arms in World War II, I found that to be one of the most compelling things. There was a quote you had from an anonymous soldier in a survey that was taken of the troops in Britain, and he said, "I am an American Negro doing my part for the American government to make the world safe for a democracy I have never known." I was like, wow. It just, that moment blew me away.
Yeah.
It was astounding to me.
Yeah. That chapter in the book I call The American Invasion, because what stands out is before we invade Nazi Europe,
right?
It's the American invasion of England, the moving of 1.4 million troops, the moving of literal armies across the ocean to the United Kingdom that really sets off that culture shock. And, the racism of that segregated army at the time, really plays out in these very surprising and upsetting and poignant ways there. And by the way, this is a legacy we are still struggling with today. I thought, sort of quote unquote, one of the main characters in the book is Staff Sergeant Waverly Woodson, who is this medic with the one black combat unit that lands on the beaches on D-Day. He is wounded even before he makes it to shore. He's 21 years old, from Pennsylvania, and is and turns out to be one of the only medics in the worst hit corners of Omaha Beach. Omaha Beach is those first 7 minutes of Saving Private Ryan. It is among the worst fighting Americans in arms have ever done anywhere in the world in history.
Ever.
And Waverly Woodson spends 30 hours on the beach in Omaha treating the wounded. He treats somewhere estimated around 200 casualties personally. Now, that's about
being wounded multiple times.
Being wounded multiple times himself. That is somewhere between 5 and 7% of all U.S. casualties on Omaha Beach. A statistically significant portion he's treating personally. He is considered at the time for the Medal of Honor. Does not get it because in World War II, there's not a single black soldier who is awarded the Medal of Honor amid the racism of that era. For the next 80 years, the Pentagon refuses to reconsider his case. There's a Clinton administration effort to reconsider the heroism of black troops. Waverly Woodson is passed over in that because the Pentagon has lost his paperwork by the 1990s. He dies in 2005, is buried at Arlington, unrecognized. And literally yesterday, 80 years later, the Pentagon announced that it had compiled sufficient paperwork that it was awarding Waverly
Right.
Woodson the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest combat valor award. And, you know, it was, to me, just this incredible moment. And, you know, of the 167,000 Allied soldiers on D-Day, you know, I include 2 pictures of individual soldiers in the book. And Waverly Woodson is one of them. And I think his story should, in so many ways, inspire us today to continue to think about this. And you touched on this a little bit in some of your reflections earlier, which is, you know, the first third of this book is all the big guys. You know, it's Roosevelt and Churchill and Montgomery and Ike. And then you get to D-Day itself, and there is nothing that any of them can do to influence D-Day.
Right.
And the story of D-Day, the story of the Allied success on those beaches, is these individual soldiers, you know, a corporal here, a sergeant there, a lieutenant there, who rally forward their units and shattered comrades and lead in a way that sort of only America trains people to lead and to take the initiative and to be entrepreneurial on the battlefield. And you see sort of the American model go up against the Nazi model of leadership that day, of the sort of top-down, split hierarchy, yada, yada, yada. And the Allies prevail because of individual actions and individual soldiers whose names you still don't know.
You know, it's interesting. You do cover in the book also a lot of interviews with the German side of this equation in Normandy, and Rommel and von Rundstedt both knew that the Atlantic Wall was a joke, was a lie. That didn't mean they didn't have formidable, you know, frontline defenses in some of these places, but that they understood that if American style mobile warfare with that kind of initiative, Rommel in particular, if we ever got ashore, that it was over, that it would not, that there was nothing. And it's fascinating to me that you have these German voices in this, especially from the leadership side, where they did not, I don't think there was ever a great deal of faith that they could, if we made a real landing, and they thought it was going to be Pas-de-Calais or Norway for other reasons, but I think they were always kind of skeptical that they could sustain, a real defense of Europe if we decided to do at scale what we decided to do.
And I think that's one of the sort of myths of D-Day that I try to take on, which is, by 1944, the sort of highly advanced, elite, mechanized German army is really mostly a figment of the past. That, particularly on the Western Front, along the Atlantic Wall, you know, almost anyone who was able to fight had been pulled to go fight on the Russian front. You know, the Eastern Front was this meat grinder for both the Russians and the Nazis. Again, sort of almost unparalleled, unthinkable horror. I mean, the Russian army loses 20 million people in that war, and that actually by June 1944, the German army in Normandy is mostly reliant upon horses and bicycles to get around. And that, you know, it's a lot of foreign conscripts. You know, there are these scenes of Americans who sort of, you know, storm these bunkers and then are surprised to find, you know, Mongolian conscripts.
Indians,
and, you know, that they're sort of confused because, you know, to Americans, they look like Japanese. And so they're like, you know, I land there to, you know, take on the Nazis, and the first people I see are Asians. And
it really was a sort of, you know, yes, it doesn't take anything away from the brutality and the intensity of the combat and the defense. But again, you get back to that logistics question, and the Germans at that point knew there was that Americans would always have all the gas in the world, all the bullets they would ever need, all the food they would ever need, all the trucks they would ever need, all the things that make it possible for those very brave young men to go out and fight. The Germans knew at that point, and maybe von Rundstedt didn't, because he was a old school Prussian aristocratic, he was sort of from another era. But in some ways, like, Hitler actually sandbagged his own people on the Western Front. He didn't trust Rommel at that point, because he thought Rommel was one of these, charismatic rising star types. And so he didn't do a lot of things Rommel advised him to do to make the Atlantic Wall more secure.
Yeah, and you look at the way that the German military under Hitler's command sort of refuses to forward locate the reinforcements that Rommel wants, and particularly at Omaha Beach.
Right.
If there had been, one or two companies of mobile infantry who could have counterattacked down the bluffs, around 8:30 on D-Day, it's entirely possible that the Omaha landing would have failed. But the Germans don't have that flexibility built into their system. Their commanders are not prone or encouraged to such feats of imagination and innovation in the moment. And basically, the Germans only launch one meaningful counterattack across all 5 beaches throughout all of D-Day, and it's not until about 4:00 in the afternoon, by which point it's too late.
And and people don't realize D-Day was a very close run thing. The 4 beaches, or the 5 beaches, they were not linked up until the 12th of June. And folks, we sunk a claw into Europe at that moment and held on to it by, nothing for a couple of days. But it does strike me that we didn't ever face, as you said, a serious counterattack. So, you point out that the book starts with the sort of marquee names of the war: Churchill, Eisenhower, Montgomery, Bradley, all the people that we know from the narrative history side. You tell a story of one particular attack, which I think it's widely regarded as one of the most consequential attacks. It's the Battle of Lafayette Bridge. Talk to us a little bit about because I think that captures the American fighting style, the moment that how close things hung in the balance, etc. Talk to us a little bit about that battle and the story that you tell about that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that part of the challenge of understanding D-Day is that D-Day was not the end; it was the beginning. And on June 7th, everyone had to wake up and start fighting all over again, and that the battle for Normandy, it ends up being a battle that lasts for 77 days before the beaches are consolidated, the reinforcements are ashore, they've built up the beachheads to sort of have the breakout moment. There is incredibly brutal fighting that takes place across those 77 days. Nowhere more brutal or more long-lasting than the battle for Lafayette Causeway, which is one of it is sort of the westernmost bridge up towards the Cotentin Peninsula, towards Cherbourg. And the paratroopers arrive from the 82nd and 101st Airborne on the night of June 5th, morning of June 6th. And they have to hold these 2 river crossings on the Western Front, both to keep the German reinforcements from storming down onto Utah Beach, but also then to provide the pathway for the American troops to break out westward into the peninsula.
Right.
And that battle in those first couple of days is sort of the preeminent military historian S.L.A. Marshall calls it later not just the fiercest battle of the European theater, but the fiercest small unit battle in the history of American arms.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is, there are 2 medals of honor won in that battle, and something like, I forget the exact number, but something like 16 Distinguished Service Crosses. I mean, that like a level of bravery and heroism that's almost unimaginable.
Astounding.
And I will confess, it is a battle that I did not know until I got into working on this book, which was part of the reason I wanted to highlight it, because I think the eastern side of the paratroopers' actions, where the British 6th Airborne is dropped, the story of Pegasus Bridge is one of the most famous of all of D-Day, or you look at the Band of Brothers, Easy Company of the 506th, Lieutenant Dick Winter's assault on Brecourt Manor, these incredibly sort of iconic battles of D-Day. And Lafayette Causeway should rank right there alongside the sort of individual battles that we know by name. And it is these small units. I mean, it is, a half dozen or dozen paratroopers holding back tank assaults and hundreds of German infantry. And, the closing quote of that chapter is one of those paratroopers, Marcus Hine, saying, how we lived, I will never understand, because so many Americans did die in that fight.
Sure.
But these sort of 4 men with bazookas that morning that hold off an entire tank and infantry assault, do so under tremendous personal risk, and yet all managed to survive.
I was really glad you included that chapter. I had read No Better Place to Die, which is about that battle a few years ago. And when I was reading through your book, I was like, oh, and I'd kind of filed it away. I read a lot of history all the time.
Yeah.
I kind of filed it away in my head. I was like, I know this story. Oh my God. And it really is. Yeah, you're correct. The intensity of that moment was truly astounding. Well, Garrett, I want to thank you again for coming on the show today. We could have this conversation for hours because, like all American men of a certain age, we become historians of World War II at some point, no matter what. It's just inevitable. But I folks, I cannot recommend this book highly enough to you. It is called When the Sea Came Alive, An Oral History of D-Day by Garrett Graff. Take the time, even if you think, oh, I'm not a reader of military history, I'm not a person who wants to contemplate this. I encourage you to read this book, because there are stories here that will speak to you about the American character, that will speak to you about courage and bravery and organization and commitment to causes well beyond just whether it's a military question or not. So once again, Garrett Graff, I want to thank you so much for coming on the enemies list today. I really appreciate it. And we look forward to talking to you again soon, and best of luck on the book.
Thank you, sir. I will say, since we're on a podcast here, I will put in a special plug as well for the audiobook of When the Sea Came Alive, which is a tremendous effort. They recorded it with a huge cast of voices. So
oh my gosh,
everyone
that sounds amazing.
Unique, and there's an incredible Churchill on it, and
I love
you get
that.
the full
oh my God,
tapestry of British accents and Canadian accents, and Irish and Scots and Germans and French, and you get a real sense listening to it of just how international and important this day really was.
Truth, and it really was, folks. It wasn't just America. It was the Great Alliance at that moment. So anyway, Garrett, thank you again, and we will talk to you very soon.
Always a pleasure, Rick.
All right. Hey, Republicans, I know that you've spent the last week with your head shoved up Donald Trump's ass, saying that his orange starfish smells like the promise of new love and the sweet, sweet grass of summer days. But I'm going to tell you something. All of you are making a gigantic mistake. All of you who say, oh, the justice system is crooked. He's an innocent man being railroaded. You all know you're lying. Every one of you knows you're lying. Every fucking one of you knows that this is a lie at a scale that we've rarely seen in this country. You all know he's guilty. I am astounded. Not that you're doing it because I know you're all chicken shits, but I am astounded that none of you have the slightest instinct for survival, because Trump will be gone someday soon. Whether he dies, whether he loses, and all of you will bear this shame for the rest of your time in public life. And I've seen it in every level. I've seen it from the, well, I'm concerned about the way the trial was set up in New York State with an unfair jury, to people like Marco Rubio who are now comparing the jury to Castro's thugs. And people like J.D. Vance who are comparing this to Soviet show trials. Listen, you motherfuckers, if you wanted show trials, I'm happy to mount them in the next Biden administration if they put me in charge of it, because all of you are on the enemies list.